Welcome, guys. This is now week 2, and what we're going to be going over this week is, getting a rough draft for your reflective narrative written, and publishing that rough draft to Blackboard so that I can review it and give you some feedback for next week's final draft. So one thing that I'm trying to do here, I actually finally got access to my classroom, and so with this now I can kind of give online demonstrations of what I'm talking about and kind of hopefully clarify some things. You just have to try and get over the 90s headphones here because I wanted to make sure I had a good mic here. And what better mic than my actual gaming headset? This is like a celebrity right here. This is what I use for all my research. So the very first thing I want to go over, and the first thing that you should be watching this week, is on the writing process. Now, everybody's heard about the writing process. Everybody's had it in high school. But the thing is what do we really use, and how does it really apply to life as we write? Because it's not so much, you have the brainstorming. I guess I can just go ahead and show you. Brainstorming. And that's what it was called in high school. And if you can't see that, hopefully you can see it pretty well. It looks like you can kind of see it there. If you remember in high school, it was called brainstorming. Well, brainstorming, you're not really just coming up with ideas. At this point, we're actually calling it the planning stage now. Those of us adult writers. Now we're calling it the planning stage. And so in the planning stage, what you're trying to come up with is the topic, but also how are you going to address these issues. We talked about rhetoric, and we talked about rhetorical strategies and purpose and genre. You have to decide on those things in order to achieve a goal. So if I'm here and I'm teaching, let's say I'm teaching a foreign language to other students, and I want to achieve a certain goal. Well, I have to have a plan of action for that. I can't just come out speaking Latin and everyone's going to automatically just pick up on it. It doesn't work that way. It's the same way whenever you write. Whenever you're writing, you have to have a plan of action. So if you were doing this in your reflective narrative, first of all, you would need a topic. And so, let's see. One topic that I've heard of so far is the VA and how, I forget what it is on the top of my head, but let's just kind of pick one. And if this is yours, well, lucky day. With the VA and using PTSD and not treating it very well and just kind of leaving out our vets to dry, so to speak. So the planning stage here, our topic becomes, of course, VA and PTSD. Now, this has to be something that I'm familiar with. Now, personally, I'm not, but let's pretend for a second that I've had an experience with PTSD and I've had an experience with the VA not helping me out on this. If that's the case, then I'm going to convey my experience in this, and I'm going to need to kind of plan those details out. So first of all, I need to kind of figure out the path of my story. And you can use that map if you want to, but with a story, you're not really going to have the web like this, because this is for, main idea, supporting detail, supporting detail, supporting detail. You can, but at this point, what you're really going to start thinking about, and one thing that will probably be a little bit easier instead of using that sort of web, is think about the plan of your story. Ask yourself first, what is it that I want to focus on? In this case, with the topic of the VA and the PTSD, I'm thinking about my experience with the VA. Let's imagine that I had PTSD, and I went to the VA hospital, and they weren't able to help me. They gave me some ibuprofen, 800 milligrams, and they said take 2 of these every day and get over it. And if you're in the military, you probably are. That's probably a legitimate diagnosis and treatment plan. But nonetheless, so with this, you'll kind of start planning out your story. First, what happened? Okay, I went to the VA. Now you're going to want to start to point out the most important parts of your story. What happened when you went to the VA? Saw crappy doctor. Okay, now this is where the story details start to come in. What do you mean by crappy? What do you mean by a bad doctor? What do you mean by a crappy experience? Start detailing those, talking about the setting, talking about the plot details, how people acted, what people looked like, what things stood out to you visually, because you want to try and paint that picture for the reader. This is more or less a combination of narrative writing, which is just another word for story writing, and persuasive writing, because at the end of the day, you want to persuade your reader that this story had an impact on your life, and therefore they should either pay attention to this, in this case you can't very well expect someone to go through the military and get PTSD and go to the VA and experience your experience. That would be horrible. You wouldn't want somebody to do that. I mean, if you were a Holocaust survivor, you wouldn't want to be like, hey, let's all go through the Holocaust. That's not really what we're trying to convey here. Instead, you're trying to convey a moral. Now, if your moral is support our PTSD patients, support our Holocaust survivors, that's one thing. If your story is about voting or donating to charities, then you want people to take an action. It really depends on what the purpose is of your story. And so that kind of leads me to the next part. After you've detailed your story, now you need the point. What is the point of your paper? Try and figure that out. Now, these are all the things that we're doing in the planning stage. Kind of things we've already gone over. And so I'm going to go over this a little bit more in detail, but first I want to get through the writing process so this video doesn't get too terribly long. Now, part 2 is the rough draft. A lot of people are going to say, well, when did we do our brainstorming and planning? At this point, your planning really took place at the end of last week, or well, yesterday, I suppose, whenever you turned in your homework and I asked you those 5 questions, what does ethos, pathos, and logos mean to you? And at the very end, there was question 4 and 5, and it was, what is your topic, and what is the social issue that you plan on undertaking here? And so at this point, we've already completed our planning, but nonetheless, I'll kind of go over organizing in a little while. At this point, though, we should already have our plan in place, so now we just need to get our information out on paper. What is my story? Tell your story. Give as many details, as few details as you want. Your rough draft is really your free pass. You get 100% as long as you meet, 1, the page requirement, which is 3 to 4 pages, and then 2, as long as you achieve the concept of a reflective narrative. That is, you tell a story, and you tell me you tell a story of a social issue that you've had an issue with. So make sure there's a social issue. It can't just be like, I went to my grandma's and my grandma didn't make very good cookies. It has to be a social issue. So you tell a story about a social issue. You tell what effect that social issue has had on your life, and you try and convey a moral through that story. So those are the requirements of the reflective narrative. As long as you do those 2 things, that is the ideas of the narrative and the 3 to 4 pages, you're going to get 100%. Now, I can't guarantee you're going to have a perfect paper. I'll come back and there'll be several markings, several suggestions, things like that. But I won't take off for them on the rough draft, because the rough draft is where you make mistakes. Because part 3 and part 4 is where you revise and edit. Now, I put those together, but I want to be very clear that they're not the same thing. Revising is strictly for content. If I go and I tell you to replace all your periods with commas, that is not content. Content is, I don't like the character of the crappy doctor. Be more explicit on what you mean by crappy. That is content because you're adding more details, you're dealing with the actual story. Editing, however, is punctuation. That's grammar, spelling, punctuation. Now, the thing there is we're going to be going through each of these steps explicitly in the next project, in Writing Project 2. Writing Project 1 is more or less a way for you to get your feet wet, so we're not going to do a whole lot of revising and editing together. You'll revise and edit based on my suggestions, but beyond that, it's really just a way for you to springboard. But nonetheless, when we get to Writing Project 2, Writing Project 3, and 4, they're going to have a planning stage, a rough draft phase. We're going to be revising and editing. If I tell you to revise, I don't want you to look at the commas, the punctuation, the periods, the spelling. I want you to look at the content. If I tell you to edit, then that means grammar, spelling, punctuation, all of those things. Last but not least is the publishing stage, or the final draft. For us, we're not publishing. We're just turning in your paper to me. I suppose you can call it publishing if you want. Publish it into my hand. And the final draft is where you've revised and edited maybe several times. In this class, it won't be more than 1 or 2 times per project. But in the real world, if you were trying to publish something, you were trying to send out something, I mean, shoot, if you're even trying to send out an email, a lot of times you're going to look over that email several times to make sure that you don't send a general, it's been a long time since I said that, you don't send a CEO or some person of importance an email that says you're going to eat them or something because you use poor grammar or bad spelling and things like that. And so that, in a nutshell, is the writing process. Now, whenever you're writing this week, you're going to have to, whenever you're doing your rough draft, you're really going to have to come up with the concept of the outline of the actual paper. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to pause this video, and I'll come back and show you actually how to outline the paper, kind of like we were doing here, but I'll do it in detail. That way you can kind of know where to go with the paper.